Hi, everybody. Welcome to our lecture for week 2 of the course, Theology of the Civil Rights Movement. This week, we're going to look at Martin Luther King Jr. at the start of his work in Montgomery, Alabama, and at the origins of the Civil Rights Movement itself. So, without ado, let's move into it. The title we've taken for this week is King, Nonviolence, and Montgomery. We're obviously combining several different topics here. On the slide, you'll see a picture of King, of course, on the right, and also Mohandas Gandhi, the Indian leader, more than a civil rights leader, really a leader of the national movement for independence of India from British colonial rule. Mohandas Gandhi is mentioned by King. I shouldn't say mentioned. That means you say something in passing. Is discussed in his text Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, which is one of our assigned readings for this week, and is recognized as one of the major influences on King's own practice of nonviolence. One of our goals this week is going to be to wrap our mind around nonviolence, not as an inaction, that is something you don't do or something you refrain from doing, but as itself a positive practice. This is very much what it was for Gandhi, as we'll see in discussing his notion of satyagraha, or truth force, that there is a kind of force being used, a force of truth, not a force of physical violence. We'll see this playing out next week as well, but we're starting out with the Montgomery Bus Boycott as an example of the practice of nonviolence. An important component of our materials for this week is the first episode of the prize-winning series from Public Broadcasting Service in the United States, Eyes on the Prize. This was made in 1987. I hope you enjoy watching it. I say enjoy. It is not entertaining in any light way, but it features interviews with people who were involved personally and directly in the origins of the civil rights movement. It's a bit of an old documentary at this point, 1987, but that has the great benefit of enabling the filmmakers actually to talk to these people. And I think there's nothing quite like it in terms of a visual documentary record of the events that this course is focused on. Our episode here is called Awakenings, and it traces the beginnings of the civil rights movement. We begin in that episode from the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955, and we trace the outrage over this murder, and as I have on the slide here, the way in which it supported resistance against segregation, particularly in the bus boycott in Montgomery. There had been several bus boycotts before, even in Montgomery itself, some decades before, but it was really that event, the manifestly unjust murder, if murder is ever just, the murder of Emmett Till, and the trial that followed, and the courageous actions of Till's mother to make that event a wake-up call to the country as a whole, especially to the African American community, in ways that you'll see discussed in the documentary. Also, in relation to the bus boycott, this event is traced in the first episode here of the documentary. We see how it unfolded, how it proved successful, and we also see how King emerged as a leader of the movement, along with, in different ways, Rosa Parks, Nixon, who was head of the NAACP in that area, and Ralph Abernathy, an important companion of King and a fellow worker in the movement. So I hope you find this episode of Eyes on the Prize eye-opening. On YouTube and lots of other outlets, you can actually purchase the whole series. I think there are 8 or 10 episodes. And I would encourage you to do that, but certainly watch the first episode for this week. Our main text for this week, and by main, I mean it's the longest, most substantial text, is King's Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. Here, King is describing his own intellectual journey from a place where he was not initially excited about nonviolence, or he saw it as maybe a useful strategy, but not as a way of life, right? Not as something that could really animate a life and motivate a movement. He comes to see it, however, in that way. And of course, the philosophy of nonviolence is closely associated with King today. Well, where did he come to this? We hear it from King himself. In college, he describes his reading of the essay Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was a leader, as it turns out, or a leading voice of the movement known as Transcendentalism in the 19th century in New England. He was also, in addition to his famous book Walden, which you may have heard of, the author of this essay on civil disobedience. Interestingly, Thoreau's essay was an important inspiration on Gandhi. And then Gandhi, in turn, inspired both Thurman and King. So there's this kind of intellectual cross pollination of ideas around nonviolence. In seminary, so that's after college, King read and was influenced by a book by Walter Rauschenbusch called Christianity and the Social Crisis. He says a little bit about Rauschenbusch in there. I just want to highlight his name. Walter Rauschenbusch was the leader of what was called the social gospel movement. This was a movement focused on the importance for Christians as Christians of being engaged in the world, of trying to achieve social justice as part of their calling as a Christian. Too often, Rauschenbusch believed Christians were focused on what we would call the world to come, heaven, right, and getting to heaven, as we say. They were too little focused, in his opinion, on living out the gospel in concrete ways in the present. King also notes that he read the social and ethical theories of the great philosophers, from Plato, Aristotle, down to Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, Locke. Why to include that? King's philosophy of nonviolence was informed by his doctoral work in philosophy. King did not have a degree in theology, or perhaps in fact he did. He was a Baptist minister. But his doctoral degree was in the field of philosophy. And I think that's important because King's message is not only a message to Christians, in my own view and in the view of many, but a message that is grounded in the whole tradition of thought throughout our cultural history. And it's significant that he was informed by the whole sweep of those authors. Another author to inform King was Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, author of Capital, or Das Kapital in German, and of the well-known Communist Manifesto that you might have seen. Of course, Karl Marx was the originator of the social political philosophy known as Marxism, economic philosophy as well. Marxism was the reigning way of thinking in the Soviet Union. And at this time, when King was beginning to be prominent on the national stage, the late 1950s, 1960s, there was, of course, a lot of opposition in the United States to communism, the form of government associated most often with Marxism at that time, and to the ideas of Karl Marx himself. So King takes some care to express with precision how Karl Marx influenced his thinking. On the one hand, he says Karl Marx presented a materialist view of history and also a kind of ethical relativism and a willingness to be open to totalitarianism. King did not agree with those premises in Marx's thinking, and he takes care to emphasize that. However, he did feel that Marx should challenge, as he puts it, every Christian to a growing concern about social justice. In the manner of a number of prominent thinkers at this time, King disagreed with those stated elements of Marx's program, but he did believe that Marx's analysis, his economics, right, his philosophy, enabled people to appreciate how the economy really worked, right, and that there was injustice built into economic and social structures in ways that had escaped our attention. So it's significant that King, who was later a democratic socialist by political affiliation, was influenced by the work of Karl Marx. A couple other influences here. One is a philosophical movement called Personalism that I've done my own doctoral research on. There was a group of philosophers at Boston University who studied personalism. As King said, it gave me metaphysical and philosophical grounding for the idea of a personal God, and it gave me a metaphysical basis for the dignity and worth of all human personality. Metaphysical means beyond the physical or outside of the physical, metaphysical. So this is a grounding for the idea of a personal God, basis for the dignity and worth of human personality. Why should we believe in a personal God if we do? Why should we believe that all human beings have dignity and worth? Is it just something that we say, or is there actually a reason for that? King believes that in the philosophy of personalism, a philosophy focused on the nature of personal and communal identities, he found that metaphysical basis. He was also challenging the ideas of Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was a really prominent, what we would call public intellectual. He was a theologian who was often consulted and often spoke on issues of the day in the 1950s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, especially. Reinhold Niebuhr, from his position at Union Theological Seminary in New York, made the following argument that King would disagree with. Niebuhr said that it was irresponsible to rely on nonviolent resistance when there was no ground for believing that it would be successful in preventing the spread of totalitarian tyranny. Reinhold Niebuhr there is thinking especially of the case of World War II, for example. There were movements, such as the Catholic Worker Movement around the time of World War II, that opposed Allied or American intervention in that conflict. However, there was, expressed here by Niebuhr, an overwhelming acknowledgement by many that Hitler and the Nazi regime posed a threat to global order beyond Europe, and that nonviolent resistance could not be effective against a threat such as Nazi Germany. Only violence was the answer. It was considered a pretty fringe opinion at the time to be a strict pacifist in response to World War II, and Niebuhr was not. Niebuhr advocated for armed resistance to the Nazi regime, armed opposition. So what King is holding forth here, though, is I don't want to comment on his positions on World War II specifically, such as they may have been, but he's holding forth nonviolence as a philosophy that can be effective, right? It can be as effective as armed resistance, and in King's view, even more effective. Also, it lays the foundation for a community. King would later call this the beloved community, which, after the cessation of tension, whether nonviolent or violent, would be able to carry on and rebuild society. So for King, nonviolence is not a kind of second best option for those without the physical strength to oppose their enemies, but is always the best option. King also, as mentioned earlier, was influenced by the philosophy of Mohandas Gandhi. We sometimes hear him called Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma is an honorific title. It means Maha Atman. Maha means great, and Atman means soul. So Mahatma Gandhi means Gandhi, the great-souled one, whereas Mohandas Gandhi is his given name and surname. King was at a talk in Philadelphia. He first heard about the philosophy of Gandhi, and especially this philosophy of satyagraha. Satya is truth, which equals love, and agraha is force. So satyagraha means truth force or love force. This is like the force of the more compelling argument, right? When you're listening to somebody, listening to maybe two people, they give different reasons for something, and you're able to recognize that the reasons given by one of the parties are more compelling than the reasons given by the other party. And so there is a kind of, what does Habermas call it? The force of the better argument, something like that. It's not a violent force, but it is something that you feel unable to deny when you see it. King writes, Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. We see this often in the history of Christianity. Thurman refers to it as well, of Christianity being understood as kind of an individual ethic. Like, what should I individually do? How can I individually seek, as Christians would say, salvation? For King, Christianity was that, an interaction between individuals, but it was also something more than that. This love ethic of Jesus, the gospel message, right? The way of life that he understood Jesus to be calling people to, could be a powerful and effective social force beyond just an interaction of individuals. A couple of slides here, I want to highlight what King calls the 6 basic facts about nonviolence. And he discusses these, and we'll have occasion to look at them more in some of the assignments. But I want to put them on the table in our lecture here. So, number 1, nonviolent resistance is not a method for cowards, it does resist. Right? So, nonviolent resistance is not non resistance. We saw that with Thurman last week, right? You can either choose to resist, Thurman says, or to not resist, right? And so we are clearly on the resist, it's over here, the resist side, right? Nonviolent resistance is resistance. It does create tension. It does have a certain force, the force of truth or of love, right? Satyagraha. It's not a method for cowards. It's not a way of hiding or withdrawing from the situation. Number 2, it does not seek nonviolence to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. In our moment, especially, it seems valuable to note this. The goal is not to humiliate or defeat the opponent, right? It's not to humble them and to take control from them. Or destroy them, as we might see in a YouTube title these days. The goal is to win his friendship and understanding. Now, we may not always be able to win the friendship and understanding, in actual fact, of people who oppose us. But if we approach the task in that manner, then we are practicing a philosophy of nonviolence. If we seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, to destroy the opponent, then we are not practicing nonviolence. Third basic fact about nonviolence: the attack is directed against forces of evil rather than against persons who happen to be doing the evil. Hate the sin but not the sinner, we might say in a common turn of phrase. You're not, again, trying to humiliate or personally defeat people, as in number 2. What you're doing is calling out the evil that you see plainly, right? And calling for a change, on part of the whole society in a certain way, but also on the part of those who are perpetrating or perpetuating that evil. You're not trying to defeat them, you're trying to convert them, as it were. You're trying to win their friendship and understanding, and thus to advance truth overall. 4, it is willing, nonviolence, to accept suffering without retaliation, to accept blows from the opponent without striking back. Unearned suffering is redemptive. Something to think about. The whole phrase, but especially the last bit. Unearned suffering is redemptive. What does it mean to be redemptive? How is one redeemed? Well, within Christianity, to be redeemed is to be saved, right? Is to be justified. In this case, if you are undergoing unearned suffering, right? You're not being punished for some kind of bad action that you took, but you're being punished undeservedly. There is redemption to be had through that. That when by accepting that, you can elevate the situation, as it were. These are all kind of intricate concepts within Christian thought, but also something that each of us can reflect upon and form our mind about. Number 5, it avoids not only external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. And he discusses here 3 kinds of love: eros, philia, and agape. And agape he calls disinterested love. Quick point on that last bit. Disinterested does not mean uninterested, like I don't care. Disinterest means that I am not narrowly self-interested in the outcome in a certain situation, right? It's not just me imposing my own interests on the situation. A judge, for example, we hope that she would be disinterested, right? If the defendant is her own sibling or child, it would be very difficult for her to be disinterested. That is, to be impartial in that situation. But agape, as a form of love, is disinterested. Importantly here too, the point is not only to, as we see in number 4, accept blows from the opponent without striking back. Okay, so you're submitting, as it were, to external physical violence, but also, and this is the trick, in doing so, not to form within yourself, within your, as he calls it here, spirit, a kind of internal violence, right? If you develop hatred toward the the one who is opposing you, then, as Thurman helps us to understand, that other person has won. Now, if you stand up and oppose the evil that they do, with courage in the face of opposition, then you, by this criteria, by these criteria, have won, right? But if you build hatred within yourself, right, then the opponent has actually succeeded in controlling your action, and in determining what your reaction will be, and that's not freedom. Last one, it is based on the conviction that the universe is on the side of justice. We've often heard Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, use this phrase, and heard it elsewhere too. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, right? So there's a curve, but it bends toward justice. The phrase moral universe here is talking about the kind of the moral character of people in a society. How willing are they to support and promote the dignity of each individual person within that society? The process of achieving more and more of that dignity is very long. However, King believes, has a confidence, if you want, has a faith that it does bend toward justice, that in the end we are making moral progress. Interesting notion. I invite you to think about it. Are we, in fact, more morally awakened, more morally, advanced than we were 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 500 years ago? And if so, how so? And how does that show itself? So those are 6 basic facts about nonviolence, and as I say, we'll have occasion to talk about those more this week in the course. Our second reading this week, and we'll say a little bit less about this and the following, so I don't detain you for too long here with my remarks, is a comic book. And this is the only comic book I think I've ever assigned in a class, so I'm really excited to share this with you. It's called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. You can see here it went for 10 cents a copy. It was published in 1957 by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a group committed to King's process or philosophy of nonviolence and practice of nonviolence. King endorsed the comic book, made editorial selections, so he was not himself the publisher of it, but he was aware of and involved in its publication. And it was meant for distribution among civil rights groups and at churches and schools. And although it was intended for the general population, it was intended as kind of an easy way in to the thinking of Martin Luther King and of the movement, what they call in the comic book the Montgomery Method, that is nonviolence. It was actually most popular at colleges. It made its rounds on college campuses across the country at a time when, as we know historically, in the late 50s and early 60s, the campus culture in the United States was becoming more politically engaged. So I want to just highlight a couple little frames here I've pulled out of the comic book. And what we can see here is not only a kind of factual account of what happened, because you will get that from looking at the comic book, but also how is it portraying King, and how is it telling the story, right? So we see a couple of things here. First of all, on the left, northern churches were open to the young minister, but in 1954, Martin Luther King and his bride decided to return to the South. King says, "It's here that God wants me to be, I know." Now, what do we have here? We have a narrative being introduced where there's this talented young minister and his wife. They have all of the options before them in terms of where they can go, but they intentionally choose to return to the South, to the American South, where King is from, right? And there to engage in the struggles of that place, and the struggle for justice. There's a certain kind of savior motif here. We will see in our reading for next week, where we'll analyze some of King's I Have a Dream speech, how King, during the civil rights movement emerged as a kind of Moses figure, right? A person who had come from far away, even though he was from the South. He went to the North, came back from the North, right? And when he returned, he led his people in this great movement of liberation. The ways in which King, both intentionally and unintentionally, just by others, is associated with Moses are significant. The story is told by kind of every man, right? Someone here named Jones. Call me Jones. My name doesn't matter, but my story is important for you as well as me. We're all caught up in it in one way or another. So we have this everyman telling the story of this talented young minister who, with his wife, has chosen to return to his home. Jones here, our everyman, continues. At that time, I knew Martin Luther King only slightly, but I soon learned that a new and important leader had come on the scene, one America would feel proud of. We have King saying here two things. You all know of the success of our one-day protest, but a single day is not enough. Let's stay off the buses until we can ride them with dignity. Let's walk to freedom. And then on the panel on the right, this is a nonviolent protest against injustice. Our chief weapons are moral and spiritual forces. We depend on love. Love and goodwill toward all men must be at the forefront of our movement if it is to be successful. So here already we have two really inspired kind of images of King. He's looking off into the distance. He's raising his finger in the manner of a preacher or a prophet, and he's declaring the intentions of this movement. He's enjoining people to engage in this nonviolent protest. Here we have an image near the end of the protests when the Supreme Court finally acts to declare bus segregation illegal. And we have in the upper left here Jones reading this headline I saw in News Dispatch that made my heart jump. And so now here we have on the upper right, on December 21st, we went back on the buses. Someone shouted vile and abusive words at a young fellow who was getting on the bus. Once I would have gotten sore about that and shouted dirty words back and maybe hit back, says the person boarding the bus. But now it was different for all of us. We all just smiled, and that did something to the man who shouted. The newspaper fellows took his picture, and they say, "Hey, you're smiling. I thought you were mad at these people." And the guy says, "I am, but it's pretty hard to stay mad when they don't fight back." Right? Last bit here, and we'll comment. One bus driver made a woman pay her fare twice. "I'm going to pray for you," she says. "Here, take back your fare. I don't want you praying for me." So we have here some depictions of interactions, of the transformation of this man who is shouting vile and abusive words is pretty sudden, a little sudden to be believed, right? But we have a portrayal, a kind of imagined portrayal of the transformation that nonviolence can enact. That not only are they on the buses, so they won, the boycott was successful, but also there's this inward change, right? The smiling of these people, their refusal to hit back, actually transforms their enemy into a friend and cultivates understanding on the part of that person. Again, hard to tell kind of how realistic this is, but this is an expression of the vision, the ultimate goal of the movement. So after telling that Montgomery story, as you see in the comic book, we move on to the method, right? Because, okay, hey, I'm impressed, right? I like how this looks. Well, how did he do it, right? Well, Martin Luther King tells how a nation won its freedom by the Montgomery Method. Years before our walk to freedom, a country of 300 million people won its independence by the same methods we used. It wasn't easy. It took years of nonviolent struggle, many long hours of prayer and suffering. The Indians, because he is talking about India, were shot and beaten, but never licked, never beat. They won their freedom, and something else too, they won the friendship and respect of the British. This is the unusual thing about nonviolence. Nobody is defeated. Everybody shares in the victory. So even though the British were, in a certain way, defeated, they left India, right? They were not beaten. They were not licked, if you want, right? And neither were the Indians. That through this love force, this truth force, satyagraha, an outcome was achieved that was seemed to be impossible, looking at it from the start. Reverend Ralph Abernathy in prayer, I think this is a especially notable image here. Ralph Abernathy, the associate and friend of King, present with him throughout his public life, often opening for him, as you see in the Eyes on the Prize video. And, we have here this image of prayer, it's the theology of the civil rights movement. There's definitely a sense in this comic book that God is looking kindly on this, right? That God has called Martin Luther King to be in the South, that God is responding through the image of these rays of light to the prayer of Ralph Abernathy. And this is an inspired movement and a movement supported, because it's supported by truth, also supported by God. A last word here from King. And God answered, Ralph, you go ahead to jail, and when you get there, you'll find me waiting there for you. That's how it will be with you, too. When the going gets hardest, if you remain true to Christian love, you'll find God waiting there for you, holding you and supporting you, giving you a victory far beyond what you hoped. So we have an image here of Abernathy going to jail in part of the boycott, but a confidence that victory will be far beyond what they'd hoped, not only to achieve the practical aims, but also to achieve that transformation, both socially and personally, on the part of all involved. And here's our last slide, friends. I just want to acknowledge this really beautiful and important text from Rosa Parks. We have King talking kind of in broad terms about his philosophy of nonviolence, and we have the comic book telling the story. But we also have here Rosa Parks, in her own words, in her own voice, telling this story. Her character, in my view, really shines through this text called Tired of Giving In. She tells here about her work with the NAACP and the launch of the bus boycott and the execution of the boycott. It opens with this famous quotation from her, passage often cited. People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, Park says. But that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. It's an important point, because if Rosa Parks just didn't move because she was physically beat, she was feeling a bit lazy, didn't want to make the trip, that is a way of de-emphasizing her contribution, right? Of making it seem like a happenstance thing. No, she was taking a stand. It's not the first time she'd taken a stand either. It's the first time that her action led to such a prominent result, and ultimately to victory in the Supreme Court, and through the bus boycott, a transformation of society in Montgomery. So, friends, that's what we have for this first week. Eyes on the Prize, Episode 1, telling the story, showing the story of the developing movement, King's pilgrimage to nonviolence, leading right through his student days and his formation of the convictions that would guide his action. We have a telling of it through the comic book, and then we have a first-person account through the voice of Rosa Parks of the events of that time. We'll continue with King next week, looking at the letter from Birmingham jail and his famous I Have a Dream speech, and I'll be back with you then with some further remarks about this very important figure. So, thank you very much.